Justice Nagendra Singh Memorial Lecture for the year 2023. Let me also thank the various luminaries on the stage, Shree R.K. Mathur, Shree Brahmdatt, Dr. Yogendra Narayan, Dr. K.C. Sharma, and all of you, of course, for giving me this opportunity to speak about a topic that would have perhaps been also very close to the heart of Justice Nagendra Singh. As you all know, he was an ICS officer, a secretary to the President of India. He was the Chief Election Commissioner, and then apart from being the Indian representative to the UN, he was also the President of the International Court of Justice. So the topic that I'm going to speak about, which is about the theory of governance and India's tradition, is something I'm sure he would have definitely been happy about. Just a second. Okay. So, India, as you all know, is a very old civilization, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years, as depending how you want to define it. And not surprisingly, during this long period, we have done a lot of thinking, a lot of experimentation in the field of governance. So there's actually a fairly rich literature going back a long, long way. There were early schools of thought. There were large amounts of disagreement between those schools of thought. So it's not as if it's a rigid sort of framework and everybody agreed. There were plenty of interesting conversations. There were thinkers like the early schools of Shukra and Brihaspati, and I'll come to those. There were ideas in the epics. There was Kautilya's Arthashastra, of course, which many of you will know about. But there were other writers too, which people have often forgotten, like Kamandak's Nitisara, or much more recently, the lectures delivered by Raja Madhav Rao to the young Sayaji Rao Gaikwad in the 19th century. So there's a very rich tradition. I have to be brief because this is a lecture, so you'll forgive me for skipping a lot. But let me say that unfortunately, although this corpus of thought is so rich, there is relatively little written about the Indian thoughts on governance. Now, when I say this, I don't mean that people have not written about, for example, the Kautilya's Arthashastra. There are whole libraries about it. But you see, it is taken in isolation. And to the extent that there is discussion about governance, it is almost exclusively about the structure of governance. Were there ancient republics? What were the layers of officialdom, mansabdari, jagirdari, and so on? There's almost very little discussion on the issue of what were the principles of governance. What was all this officialdom supposed to be doing? What are the end objectives of governance that our ancient thinkers all the way down to the 19th century had? And so my lecture is going to focus on this. What were the principles of governance? What were the intellectual frameworks and philosophical principles of governance that our intellectual tradition talks about? So to do that, let's go right to the beginning, and you'll see why perhaps this discussion didn't get started, because so much of it is fragmentary. There are texts that are available only in bits and pieces. A lot of it requires guesswork. There are debates and so on. So let's go back right to the beginning, to the Bronze Age. And the history of the Bronze Age in India comes from two separate sources. And one of these sources is the ancient Vedic texts, particularly the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Vedic texts. Again, debate about how old it is, but it's perhaps somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, or maybe even more years old. And then there is the archaeological remains of the Harappan civilization, which is in the northwest of India, but now there are increasingly more archaeological sites from the Bronze Age which are being found in the Gangetic Plains as well. Not far from here, Bronze Age chariots have been found, for example, in Bagpat, in Sonauli, and so on. So again, there's a lot of archaeological sites that are popping up as well. The problem is there's a lot of acrimonious, I think unnecessarily acrimonious debate about how these two are linked. And I'm not going to try and attempt to resolve this in today's lecture, except to say that both these traditions, when you dig into them, give you very little idea of how actually governance was carried out. So, for example, the Rig Veda, obviously it's a book on religious rituals, philosophy, and so on. It does give you some sense of this type of society that was there. But the sum of what we can tell from the Vedic texts about governance in that time is that we are dealing with relatively small tribal kingdoms which were ruled over by chieftains. The chieftains were supported by two bodies. One was called the Samiti, which was a general body, and a Sabha, which was a more smaller executive council or advisory committee of some sort. We don't know exactly how this functioned, but it is interesting to see that the terms have actually switched in meaning. So today, when we talk about the Samiti, we usually mean an advisory committee, and when we say the word Sabha, we mean Lok Sabha or some larger gathering. So in some ways, the meanings have switched. But nonetheless, beyond this, we can tell very little about how Vedic societies were governed. Now, when we turn to the archaeology of the Harappans, we have a similar problem. We all know that there was a lot of emphasis on municipal management, standardization, and so on. But who ran these things? Why did they standardize? What were the principles on which they ran these things? We have very little idea. Beyond saying that the fact that there was clearly an elite in these societies, almost all the bigger cities tend to have an upper city, and there tends to have the public buildings, the somewhat better quality or larger dwellings and so on. So obviously these societies had some sort of elite. And those of you who believe that the Vedic society is some sort of a subset of the Harappans would argue maybe this is where the Sabha and the Samiti would come and meet. But frankly, we know very little. So I'm sorry, we'll have to move on to the next stage to get into anything slightly meatier, and which is the Iron Age. Now, the Iron Age does provide us much more texts. This is the era of the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And here we can see that the idea of the state has evolved to something much more concrete. So we have moved maybe 1,000 or more years, and the states are more embedded. They are more complex idea of the state is there. And here in the epics, we hear about principles of governance a bit more often. In particular, you have the Raj Dharma Parva of the Mahabharata. Here you have, for example, Bhishma lying on the bed of arrows tells Yudhishthir, even as he is dying, about the principles of governance. So there is a whole Raj Dharma Parva where these principles are enunciated. You also see that in the Ramayana, in particularly the Balakand, where the young Ram is taught about how to rule, and he's given examples from his father's kingdom and so on. So some principles you get. The problem is that the way this information is provided is in the form of wise aphorisms. And clearly, some thought had gone into it, but if you take all of that, it is very difficult to create an internally consistent framework of principles. There'll be the odd aphorism about taxation not being excessive, or about the king being restrained, about the importance of rule of law and so on. But can you put it all together and actually run a kingdom based on it? Very, very difficult. So at the very least, it's not laid out in a nice textbookish sort of way, the way, for example, Kautilya's Arthashastra will be done in the next round. So you have to work quite hard to try and work out what their concepts of governance were. So the way to do it, one way to do it, is to go and look at what are the intellectual concepts that are there, which are underlying all of this. And one of the important intellectual concepts that exists in the Iron Age is the idea of Matsya Nyaya.
So what is Matsya Nyaya? It is a law of the fish, in which the big fish eat the small fish. It's essentially the Indian version of the law of the jungle. And the purpose of the state is to avoid Matsya Nyaya. So this is an important concept, and I'll come back to it. In the Indic tradition of thought on governance, the avoidance of Matsya Nyaya is a very important idea. The other concept that comes up frequently is that a king must not rule his kingdom for himself, but for the betterment of the people, and that the best way to do this is to adhere to the principles of dharma. Now, it's also interesting here that there is no conception here of, say, the European idea, medieval idea of divine right. The right of the king to rule basically comes from the adherence to dharma and the betterment of people. He has no real divine right as such to rule. Now, putting all of these different ideas, now we have a problem. What does dharma mean? Now, this is unfortunately an extremely complicated concept, as you know, which is very difficult to translate. There's long discussions in both the epics about what this actually means. But may I say that in practice, what it meant is quite interesting. Now, according to Meenakshi Jain, who's a well-known historian, as you know, so Professor Jain says that one practical application of dharma principle was the acceptance of common practice, conventions, contracts and rules. In effect, it is akin to common law, i.e. every group or every context had its own dharma. So in other words, this is again quite a different way of thinking about governance principles. The solution is very contextual. It is not one grand law that comes across. And evolving situations give evolving solutions. So therefore, this is not a time where something like a rigid social code, like a Dharma Shastra, would come out as being a particularly good framework for running a state. As and when they may have existed, these did not exist as bodies of law for enforcement. So the Dharma Shastras, for example, should be seen as maybe opinions for reference. I don't think ever there was a kingdom or empire in India that was based on enforcing any Dharma Shastra. Nonetheless, it is possible to work out, however, the interesting debates about governance that may have existed between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And I'm going to give you one interesting instance which you may find interesting. At least I think, and I think I'll let you decide whether my interpretation is correct or not. But it seems to be that the two epics appear to be having a debate. What is this debate? So on one side you have the Ramayana, which makes the case that the word of the law and the enforcement of the contract is the single most important way to avoid Matsya Nyaya. So the word of the contract has to be applied. So you hear Prana Jai par bachan na jai, right? That is the conceit. So you have throughout the Ramayana situations where Ram is having to adhere to contracts or laws which are blatantly unfair. He knows they are unfair, but he still adheres to them because the Ramayana is making the case that, look, without this you will have Matsya Nyaya. Right? So it's not the case that the Ramayana is arguing that Keike's demand was just. The Ramayana knows, Rama also knows that it is unjust. But a promise has been made and therefore it must be adhered to. And so this idea is so strong that the Ramayana itself is actually changed in various ways to enforce this point. So an entire section called the Uttar Ramayana is actually added at the end of Valmiki's Ramayana. By the way, Valmiki's original Ramayana did not include the Uttar Ramayana. The original Ramayana ends with Ram and Sita returning to Ayodhya. That is the end of the original Ramayana. But an entire new section is added about what happens after Ram comes back and he rules his empire. And here, the whole point that seems to be enforced is that Ram has to enforce a law which pre-exists. He didn't create the law, it just happened to exist. But now that it exists, he has to enforce it. And he does not justify the sending away of Sita to the forest. There is no attempt in Ramayana to justify it. It just says that this law exists, and as Ram as the king has to enforce it. So this is an important point about Ram Rajya. Ram Rajya is not utopia. In Ram Rajya, Ram himself is actually utterly miserable. He's pining for his wife, he does not remarry, and he lives in a life of unhappiness and quite guilty, if I may say so. But his people are happy and prosperous. And the point that is being made is that Ram Rajya is a place where the rulers apply the law to themselves. That is the point that Ramayana is effectively making as a principle of governance. That is the way Matsya Nyaya is held in abeyance. The rulers too apply the laws to themselves. Now it turns out that Mahabharata does not agree with this. The Mahabharata, one of the key protagonists of course is Yudhishthir. And Yudhishthir repeatedly tries to do the same thing that Ram does, adhere to all the laws, rules, contracts and so on. But it doesn't lead to Ram Rajya or a happy outcome. Repeatedly, it leads to in fact unhappy outcomes, and in fact it culminates all the way in a great war which is so destructive that it almost destroys civilization itself. So the Mahabharata makes a somewhat different point, that simply blindly following the word of the law or applying the contract blindly, enforcing it, is not the way to avoid Matsya. You have to have some conception of the spirit of the law. You have to have some conception of natural justice. And so you have an interesting situation where Krishna, who is by the way an avatar of the same God, Vishnu, as Ram, right? He's the same God. But he's come here, it's almost as if he came back to say, we made one point, but there is another point to be made. And the point is, word of law is important, but the spirit of law is also important. And so you have this situation where Draupadi, since her husbands have lost her in the game of dice, Draupadi is now a slave. And her new owners have a right to do what they wish with her. But there is no rule about the length of a sari. So Krishna takes this loophole and, they're allowed to pull the sari, but the sari can be infinitely long. And so effectively, this word of the law is enforced, but in some sense, natural justice is also done. And you see that repeatedly. Whether, Arjun avenging the killing of his son, for example, and so on and so forth throughout the rest. So you can see this debate. Now this debate between the word and spirit of the law has not been resolved to this day. It's a raging debate to this day. So I'm not saying the epics resolved this debate, but I'm just pointing out there were some interesting thoughts about governance that were already there. Now time passes forward. And we are now into the late Iron Age and coming into the historical period. Here now we begin to see new schools of thought emerging. So there are many schools of thought, but two important schools of thought emerge out of this. One of the schools of Brihaspati, who was the guru of the Devas. And the other is the school of Shukra, who was the guru of the Asuras. Now I want to make it very clear right up front that the idea of the Devas and the Asuras being good and bad is actually a much later idea. The original idea of the Devas and the Asuras is more like a yin and yang idea. They are the gods and the anti-gods, and they are seen as being somewhat in a tension, yes, but they both need each other. So for example, in the Samudra Manthan, both of them have to come to do the Samudra Manthan. So please don't confuse it with later ideas of good and bad. The Asuras and the Devas are both different shades of grey, let's say. And here you have the school of Shukra, which is the Asuric school,
which is essentially making the case of Dandaniti. What is Dandaniti? Where they make the thing that the way to govern is effectively to create a set of sensible rules and to enforce those rules. That is the key to good governance, Dandaniti. That's the Shukra school, the Asuric school. And then there is the Brihaspati school, which agrees that Dandaniti is needed, but it states that you also need policy, particularly economic policy, Varta. So there is this debate that these two schools are having coming into the early historical period. Unfortunately, there is a problem that while we know from other texts that this debate was there, we do not have any uncorrupted versions of either the Shukra Nitisara or of the Brihaspati Sutra. So we have to guess at what was in these texts from other texts. There is no good copy of the Brihaspati Sutra. It only survives as a fragment. The only thing I found was an English translation by Dr. F.W. Thomas, published in 1921, but it's just a fragment and it doesn't give any meaningful sense of the wider document or the underlying philosophy of governance. So, and the same problem is there with Shukra Niti Sara, which survives as a late medieval abridgment. There is an English translation by Professor Binoy Shorkar, published in 19 exist in the late Iron Age. So I don't think we should take them too seriously. And you also have Manusmriti, who is also another of the schools of the early period. And again, we have a later version of the text from somewhere in 3rd, 4th century AD. So again, we have no idea what these texts originally meant, other than other texts mention that this is what their arguments were. So this brings us to the one text which is genuinely clear about what the principles of governance are, which is Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now Kautilya, who was Kautilya, is a very interesting character in his own right. His name was Vishnugupta Kautilya, otherwise known as Chanakya. We are in Chanakya Puri, so it is named after him. And he was a professor of political economy at Takshashila University at the time that Alexander invaded India. And he was very shocked by this, and so he made his way to Magad to ask for help from the Nandas, and famously was insulted by the Nandas, so he came away back to Takshashila, bringing with him a young student, Chandragupta Maurya, who he then taught to be the first great emperor of, historically known emperor of India. So we are now talking about 322 BC, thereabouts, when the empire was created, and of course Kautilya along with Chandragupta are co-founders of this empire. So he's not just a theoretician and a professor, he was actually a founder of an empire, and although we do not know for sure whether his Arthashastra was actually used exactly to run this empire, since the Arthashastra by most reckoning was already written before the empire was created, so I think it is reasonable to say that it must have been used as at least to some extent, as a blueprint of how the first great empire, the Mauryan Empire, was run. And it is a very thick text. Unfortunately, the general discussions about it tend to focus about the mandala theory about international relations and about spies and so on. They are actually a very small part of the text. Most of the text actually deals with municipal laws, taxation, urban management, legal system, military organization, and all kinds of different things. It's very detailed and in many, many ways. So here is a text which clearly has the principles laid down, and it starts by telling you what those principles of governance are. So right in the beginning, Kautilya states that he is not the origin of many of these ideas. So this is also interesting. So there is a conception of referencing already. So he starts the text right in the beginning with salutations to both Shukra and Brihaspati. So he's already telling you that he's drawing on pre-existing corpus of thought. And then he says that there are different schools of thought and different areas of knowledge. So what are the areas of knowledge that Kautilya lays out that one must know in order to run a kingdom? So the first, he says, is Dandaniti, which is the rule of law. Then he says Varta, which is policy, especially economic or commercial policy. Then he says Anivikshiki, or philosophical frameworks. So to put it in a modern context, you could have philosophical frameworks that we use today: socialism, capitalism, and so on. So philosophical frameworks. Entrayi, which literally means the first three Vedas, but could be taken to mean more widely the general cultural context. And then Kautilya then says that he then lists out how the different schools of thought are different from each other. So he then says, as I already told you, that the school of Shukra is focused on Dandaniti. So basically says good laws and their strict enforcement is the main tool of governance. But then he also says that if you overuse laws and are excessively strict, then you say you'll get a rebellion and misuse. Then he says, there is the school of Brihaspati. As I said, school of Brihaspati accepted Dandaniti, but they also emphasized Varta, which is it expected the state to use both law and economic policy interventions. Then he says there is the school of Manu. Manu accepted both Varta and Dandaniti, but it said that you needed Trai, i.e. the cultural context. So the point he was making is that it's not good enough to have laws and policy. The cultural context in which you apply it, you have to know something about. And then finally Kautilya says you also need to have a philosophical framework for thinking about policy. And then Kautilya says, I disagree with all the previous. I don't think you need one or the other. You need all four areas of knowledge in order to be able to govern a kingdom properly. Now, with this knowledge, Kautilya then goes on to make a case for a strong but limited state. Now, this is important to understand. Kautilya is a realist. Okay, he has no sense of humor about many things. He's not an idealist at all. He believes that the role of the state, i.e. the king, is to provide security from internal and external threats, administer justice, provide infrastructure and municipal services, regulate and encourage commercial activity, and to collect taxes. The Kautilyan state does not allow for any laxity in this area. So he has no sense of humor about these areas. But on the other hand, he is not wildly keen on extending the role of the state beyond these things. So for example, he is not a welfarist. The role of the state in helping the poor, etc., yes, it's needed, but it's needed during emergencies like a natural calamity. He thinks of the state essentially as a framework in which civilization functions. It's for the society to decide where it really wants to go. The state is there to provide the overall framework. So the question is, why is Kautilya limiting the role of the state in this particular way? Now, of course, other intellectual traditions also have this business about limiting the role of the state. So in the Western context of limiting the state, the usual reason that the Western tradition talks about tends to derive its idea about limiting the state in terms of the rights and freedoms of individuals, right? So the state needs to be limited because of the innate rights and freedoms of individuals. But it's quite interesting that in Kautilya's approach, he has a very Indian reasoning for doing this. The problem of corruption and misuse of power. And so, he repeatedly talks about his suspicion of the states. You all know about Kautilya's suspicion and use of spies, etc. What is interesting is that this is not directed at the citizens. Almost all of it is directed either at the enemies of the state, but a lot of it is towards government officials. And in fact, he states very clearly that it is no more possible to monitor the official corruption than it is to measure how much water a fish is drinking. In fact, he states it explicitly in this way. Just as it is impossible to know when a fish is drinking water while it is swimming, so it is impossible to find out when government servants misappropriate money.
Wow.
Right? So, now let me show you how he applies this in Varta. So this is the principle. How does he apply this to, say, economic policy? I'm an economic advisor. How would he apply this to economic policy? Well, he says that the king shall promote trade and commerce by setting up trade routes by land and by water, as well as market towns and ports. Trade routes shall be kept free from the harassment of courtiers, state officials, thieves, frontier guards, and from being damaged by herds of cattle. Now, since Kautilya is one of my intellectual heroes, I am rather concerned that as a serving civil servant, his opinion of me was that I was somewhere between a thief and a herd of cattle. But that's as it may be. Now, Kautilya then lays out all kinds of strict regulations. For example, many of his ideas would go against many of the conceptions you may have about it. For example, he was totally against prohibition. His idea was very much about regulation of vices. Regulate prostitution, regulate production and consumption of alcohol. But he was totally against prohibiting these things. And he doesn't state it, but my sense is because he always is suspicious of officials, that if you ban something, they will take advantage of it. Now, what you can see here is that Kautilya's Arthashastra puts forward a no-nonsense, realist approach to governance. His exact measures, of course, are not valid today. I mean, I don't want to use his exact rules, traffic rules for bullock carts today, would not make sense. But his principles, to a large extent, can be utilized even today. So I think it's quite extraordinary. And it certainly is the case that he set up an empire. It was well functioning, at least during the period of Chandragupta and his son Bindusara. So at least for 2 generations, a large empire was run using these principles and run well. But that doesn't mean that everybody agreed with him. So when we reach the generation, the 3rd generation of the empire, there is actually an Ashokan rebellion. So let me tell you about Ashoka's rebellion. What happens is that in the year 274 BC, Bindusara suddenly dies, and the crown prince Sushima, who is supposed to take over the crown, is far away in the northwest. So there is a palace coup in which a lesser known prince called Ashok, who was not supposed to be the next ruler, suddenly captures power. He essentially eliminates all his brothers and all other male claimants to the throne, and all ministers who oppose him, possibly with the help of Greek mercenaries. And then when Sushima gets back to the capital, he basically has him killed in the moat of the entry to Pataliputra. So this is how Ashoka comes to capture the throne. The story goes that he is initially very, very cruel, but then he invades Kalinga, and shocked by his own cruelty, he becomes a Buddhist and a pacifist. Now, I've written about this more extensively in other places, but let me just put it out here. There is almost no evidence of this story of his conversion to Buddhism and pacifism. The evidence, to the extent we have any, clearly suggests that he was already a Buddhist before he became king, perhaps, and that even after Kalinga, he did not become a pacifist. He continued to carry out many invasions, massacres, etc. well after Kalinga. So this story of his pacifism is, I'm sorry to say, a late 19th century or early 20th century invention to fit in with various political ideologies of that time. The historical evidence basically considers him Chanda Ashoka or Ashoka the Cruel. Now I'm not going to go into what he actually did, because my discussion today is about his principles of governance. Here too, interestingly, he was a rebel. And he makes very significant deviations from Ashoka's strong but limited state. Now, how do I know about this? Well, by reading his edicts. So, look at what he does. You have here Chanakya. You see, what was Kautilya's king? Kautilya's king is basically a self-restrained enforcer of the law, right? That's what he is. But Ashoka declares himself the following: all men are my children. He then goes further to literally argue for a welfarist nanny state. He says,
Just as a parent entrusts his child to a wet nurse, the Rajuka officials have been appointed by me for the welfare and happiness of the people. Now, here, all of you will appreciate that this is a completely different opinion of government officials. I mean, Kautilya would never have approved of the expansion of the state, and he would certainly not be talking about trusting the officials to be the wet nurses to the people. And he goes on, Ashoka. He says, he creates all these large numbers of rules and regulations. So if you go through Ashoka, he's a very realist. Limited rules, clear what he's trying to do. But here you have Ashoka coming up with these kind of rules which are clearly sort of welfarist interventions into daily life. So here is another example of one of his rules. He says, in the 8th day of every fortnight, in the 14th and 15th of Tisa, Purnavasu, the 3 Chaturmasis and the other auspicious days, bull are not to be castrated. Goats, rams, boars and other animals that are to be castrated are not to be. On Tisa, Purnavasu and the fortnight of Chaturmasi, horses and bullocks are not to be branded. Now, as you can see, there's a very big difference with the practical rule making of the Arthashastra. I mean, if Kautilya had remained alive, he would have argued, what difference does it make to the bull what day of the month he's castrated? So you can see a very difference in opinion. And then Ashoka goes on about the expansion of the state. He expands the purview of the state into creating a cadre of something called the Dharma Mahamantas, which are basically the religious police. And they are given the job of going to people's houses and making sure that they're all following the Dharma and being pious and, doing good deeds. And although Ashoka goes at pains to say that, his Dharma Mahamantas do not enforce Buddhist religious laws and other groups, and he's quite explicit in being respectful towards non-Buddhists, the very fact that such social control existed, I would argue, is quite worrying. And what happens as a result of this expansion of the state? Well, while Ashoka is still alive, this expansion of the state leads to a large fiscal crisis. And we know that the empire begins to crumble while Ashoka is still around. So the Mauryan Empire essentially sort of spirals into this fiscal crisis with open conflict within the royal household. And then the central government's grip on the empire begins to collapse. And thus, we know that with the shift from Kautilya's strong but limited state to Ashoka's weak but all-pervasive state, it ended in tears. Within a few years of Ashoka's death, the Mauryan Empire collapsed and fell apart. Thus, India's first experiment with big government ended in tears. This is the historical evidence that we have of our experimentation with governance systems. Now, from here on, for the next several centuries, Kautilya's Arthashastra becomes now the dominant text that is much debated. It appears everywhere. Clearly, people have this nostalgia for the great empire and this book that was used to sort of run this empire. So centuries pass away. You still see other texts appearing, being debated. There are new texts that I mentioned, Dharma Shastras, for example, that appear as well. You have the Manu school and the Manu Smriti. But they are all more or less, as far as I can tell, all about personal laws. So they include laws relating to the caste system, which is increasingly, by the way, becoming rigid. But they don't really, at least to the extent I can tell, introduce the intellectual framework for governance or economic management in quite the same way as the Arthashastra. So in my way, and my view, at least from perspective of governance, they are definitely inferior texts. So you really have to wait till the Gupta period, when another empire rises, where a new text is written in the same sort of strain. And this is Kamandak's Nitisar. And it's important here to remember that the Guptas very much model themselves on the Mauryas. The memory of the Mauryas was still there. There's a 6 centuries later, by the way. There's 600 years difference between the Mauryas and the Guptas. But the Guptas very much remember about the Mauryas. So at least two of their major kings are named Chandragupta. So many of the things they do are clearly inspired by the Mauryan idea. Samudragupta goes all the way down to South India to conquer the southern tip of India, to re-establish these ideas. And of course this shows through, this admiration shows through in art and culture. So there is this very famous play called Mudra Rakshas from the Gupta period, which talks about how Chanakya took over the Nanda Empire. So so there's a lot of sort of, just like today we kind of look back to them, the Guptas were looking back to the Mauryas. So in that spirit, you have this thinker called Kamandak, who writes a book called Niti Sara. Niti Sara basically means the essence of policy making. That way I would translate it as that. So we don't really know who Kamandak is. He was either a scholar who was very connected to the government of the time, or a court official, or both of some sort. But he is not from the early period of the empire. He is clearly about when the empire has already been well established, because you can clearly see certain things that creep up in the way he thinks. For example, he rather likes aristocrats. And so Chanakya is much more open to merit, because he's created an empire, so he likes new talent, so to speak. Kamandak, on the other hand, has a love for well-born aristocrats. So there are certain subtle differences. But nevertheless, Kamandak's Niti Sara then starts right in the beginning, just like Kautilya had started by talking about Shukra and Brihaspati. In the same way, Kamandak starts by salutations to Vishnugupta Kautilya. So you can see the links. And then he talks right in the beginning about the role of Kautilya in helping Chandragupta build the empire. And given his obvious admiration for Kautilya, it shouldn't be surprising that Kamandak broadly reiterates many of Kautilya's ideas. So, of course, it's a shorter text, and the Niti Sara has some preference for military and international affairs type of side of things. So he really gets into more of that. So it's not quite as useful as the Arthashastra on governance type issues, but to the extent he talks about them, you can see a reiteration of many of Kautilya's ideas. However, Ashoka's welfarist ideas may not have entirely been lost. So this is also quite interesting. So in between all this reiteration of Kautilya's ideas, Niti Sara also adds a couple of sentences which sound strangely Ashokan. So let me give you one of them. He has a sentence there where he states, nursing the tenderest compassion in his heart and without deviating from the path of dharma, a king should wipe away the tears of the oppressed and the helpless. Now this sounds rather Ashokan, and even if I don't know what it actually meant in practice, at the very least it means that by Kamandak's time, even if they hadn't incorporated this idea of direct welfarist intervention, at the very least it meant that the political establishment now was using somewhat softer words than Kautilya's dry, realist kind of language. Now, of course, between that time, afterwards, there are many, many texts. And the sad part is, there very, very few of them are either translated or in the public domain, and have not been properly studied. Now, my sense is there must be many more texts. After the Kamandak's works, there must have been many other texts written. The problem is there hasn't been adequate amount of hunting for them. There are literally 4 lakh texts lying around with the National Manuscript Mission which haven't been properly looked into. And to the extent they're looked into, they tend to be Sanskritists and grammarians who tend to dig into all of this, not economists. And this is a complaint I've made to my mentor and colleague, who is also a Sanskritist, Dr. Vivek Devroy. And so we are hoping that we'll try and create some way of digging into this and looking for new texts. But there is a long gap after this about good texts that we can bite our teeth into. There are commentaries by others,
There are abridgments, as I said, of the Shukra Nitisara, but there are no new ideas, so to speak, that you can really stick your teeth into. And this is also a problem, by the way, of the medieval period and after the arrival of the Islamic rulers. There is obviously new ideas coming from the Islamic schools. Many of them are imported into India. Many indigenous Hindu ideas are also incorporated into this. But again, you don't have a text like the Arthashastra which delineates the rules and principles of governance. What you do have is things like Abu Fazal's Aini Akbari. So I'll use it as an example. It's 2 thick volumes, lots of description of the times, about history, about the layers and functionaries, the Mansabdari system, and so on. But it doesn't tell you exactly what the Mansab, other than making sure they had the right requisite number of horsemen, etc. It doesn't tell you what exactly they are supposed to be doing as far as governance is concerned. Now it's possible if someone really goes in there and does some research, again to create draw out some principles, just like I did it with the epics. It's possible to draw out principles of governance, but somebody has to do this work, so maybe so both for the early medieval period, this is the post-Gupta period, and for the Islamic period, if there are scholars here who want to go in there either to look for new texts, that maybe there are texts I don't know about, or to do the hard work of digging through texts like Aini Akbari and try and figure out these principles of governance. So somebody who is willing to do that, please do so. We have same problem, by the way, with the Maratha period. We do have Amartya Ramchandra Pant's Ajna Patra, but again, it's a very short text. It tells you lists of layers of governance, of officials, and so on. There seems to a vague sense that it may have been inspired by the Arthashastra, but again, not enough detail to be able to really draw out principles of governance. So you really have to skip all the way to the 19th century to find another attempt done in this way. And you find here an attempt done in the 19th century by Raja Madhava Rao called the Hints at the Art and Science of Government. This is really a set of lectures done in the 1880s. And these were a set of lectures by Raja Madhav Rao to Sayaji Rao Gaikwad, the young Maharaja of Baroda. Now Madhav, who is Madhav Rao? He was a scholar and he was a Diwan, i.e. Prime Minister, of several princely states including Travancore, Indore and Baroda. And in these lectures he brings together both ancient ideas of upholding dharma, but by this time, remember, many modern European ideas are also finding their way into the conversation. So he's also bringing in here the modern idea of limited sovereignty, for example. So, for example, you have to remember that the instructions he's given, it's not just the limited sovereignty, i.e. the idea of a limited monarch, which of course comes from the British tradition of limited monarchy, but also the context that the Indian princely states are further limited by the fact that you had the overarching colonial rule, architecture around them. So these instructions are given in the context of British colonial overlordship as well. So Rao, interestingly, for example, warns the young prince against taking on the mighty empire. So, very different from the context of Kautilya, who is the creator of our empire. Here Madhav Rao is saying, don't pick a fight with these guys. So that's one of the things he's trying to tell you. But at the same time, he's also interesting, as an aside, he's telling a young teenager presumably about principles of governance, while he's instructing them to note the impact of Sayaji, because Sayaji would grow up to be one of the most subversive princely rulers of any Indian state, princely state, because he would do many things. Not the least support people like Aurobindo Ghosh, later Shree Aurobindo, to set up, for example, the revolutionary movement in many subtle ways. So he would be quite a rebellious character in his own right. But nevertheless, since we are here about Madhav Rao's text, but in Madhav Rao's text at least, he warns the young prince not to pick fights with the British. He also instills in the king the idea of being the sort of practice self-restraint. This is an idea that comes throughout all the text, idea of self-restraint of the king. The state must be self-restrained. You keep seeing this. But here he is not the self-restrained enforcer of the law. Because by this time, by the way, another innovation has happened, because the princely states by now have an independent judiciary. So the prince's role is no longer being the self-restrained enforcer of the law, because there is an independent judiciary already in place. And Rao therefore states, now we have succeeded in establishing in these territories a set of judicial tribunals, such as the country requires. The judicial tribunals have been working well and fulfilling their objects. Let me inform your highness of the clear result of my study and experience, namely, that any Maharaja who undertakes to administer public justice personally must inevitably fail. So you can see how the thoughts have evolved over time till the 19th century. Now that Dandaniti has been taken away, so what does Rao want the young Sayaji to do? Well, the only thing now left for him to do was to pay attention to Varta, which is policy. So Sayaji is encouraged to do the following things: public works and infrastructure, commerce and industry, education and health. So it is with this advice then eventually that Baroda would become one of the better run public states in India. And to this day, what it was originally the Baroda state is even now taking advantage of many of the investments done at the time of Sayaji Gaikwad. Incidentally, Rao had also been the Prime Minister of another state, Travancore, where many of these things were also true. Of course, as I mentioned, Sayaji was quite rebellious, and he interpreted something that Rao told him in an interesting way. So Rao is quite interesting, but one of the sort of advice that he gives to Sayaji is that he must attract talent to the Baroda princely civil service. So he states, there is a large demand in British India for educated and upright men, and the remuneration that we pay must not be less than what the British government offers. So Baroda was quite interesting. They were willing to match the salaries of the ICS at that time. And this would lead Sayaji to end up supporting many outstanding individuals. I of course mentioned Aurobindo Ghosh, who was one of the founders of India's freedom struggle, but of course also Bhimrao Ambedkar. To conclude, now, I think spoken for quite some time, that India does have a very long and rich history of thinking about principles of governance, as distinct from the form of government, which I didn't discuss at all here. This short essay and lecture attempts to provide a brief overview of this history, the main debates, the principal characters. We also see that there is this sense of continuity in these things. So Kautilya references Shukra, Manu and Brihaspati, while Kamandak then mentions Kautilya and so on. And even as we deal with the fragmentary and whatever texts we have, we see there are concepts like Raj Dharma, which are mentioned in Iron Age texts in the Mahabharata, the epics, as I mentioned, but then also turn up in the 19th century with Madhav Rao's lectures. So this is a very long tradition, and I hope that future generations of Indians will also partake on this generation, and not only will they partake in it, will also take forward this tradition and now write new Niti Saras and new Arthashastras. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind.